So hi everyone, good afternoon. Thanks very much for joining us at our session. I'm just going to leave 1 more minute so that I can see that people are still joining. So we'll just wait until 1 or 2 and then we'll kick off. So actually, I think it looks like the numbers joining have slowed down. So hopefully, there will be a few more coming in, but we'll make a start because we've got quite a lot to get through in the next hour. So firstly, welcome to this IFOA Thought Leadership Series webinar. So this is the 3rd event in the series, The Road to Egypt, which is focusing on climate and sustainability issues. So my name is Sarah Jocelyn. I'm a member of the IFOA Sustainability Board, co-chair of the IFOA Early Careers Sustainability Board, and an actuary at the Government Actuaries Department, where I chair our internal climate change group. I was also lucky enough to attend COP26 in person a couple of years ago. So I'm delighted to be chairing this event, which is titled From Egypt to Dubai, an early career perspective on progress made since COP27. So the IFOA is actually hosting a series of 4 webinars, and these are seeking to move the debate forward on themes discussed in the last series looking at COP26 and COP27, as well as COP2015 in Montreal. So through this series, we'll provide a platform for prominent contributors within our own actuarial thought leadership community, so that our members and others can understand the perspectives of a wide range of parties. Within that context, today's event will focus on an early careers perspective, on progress that has been made since COP27. You'll be able to watch the full video recording on demand via the IFOA's virtual learning environment and YouTube channel. So just as a bit of background to why it is that we're doing this. So you may be aware that during COP27 last year, the IFOA Sustainability Early Careers Board provided coverage of the conference on LinkedIn and the IFOA's blog page. So today, 3 of the group's members, a mix of early career actuaries and actuarial students, are coming together to provide their personal reflections on COP27, review the progress made, and share aspirations for COP28. So I'm delighted to be joined by Elle Walker. Elle's an Associate Director at Willis Towers Watson, where she focuses on climate and ESG risks for life insurers. She has more than 6 years actuarial experience, having previously worked in DB pensions and bulk annuities industries. Andrew Hetherington. Andrew is also a qualified actuary with experience across insurance and pensions. And for the IFOA, he's a volunteer for the Sustainability Early Careers Board. And Trinani Ramkrashan, and apologies because I've probably just got your surname completely wrong and should have asked that at the beginning. Trinani works as an actuarial analyst in the financial service consulting team at Mazars, working with life insurance clients on a range of financial reporting and consulting projects. Like me, Trinani is a member of the IFOA Sustainability Board, and she's within the team in the board that focuses on sustainable development goals. She's also a co-chair of the Sustainability Early Careers Board. So towards the end, we're going to be asking everyone to complete the feedback form, which will be accessible on the screen via the QR code. But for the moment, I'm just going to hand over and start our session, and I hope you all enjoy it.
Brilliant. So welcome to the webinar. I'm delighted to be involved along with the team as a member of the IFOA Sustainability Board and co-chair of the Sustainability Early Careers Board. So to start off, I'll be explaining about COP, how it's evolved over the years, and also expectations for the future. I'll also be talking about how COP relates to actuarial work as well. So if we move to the next slide, please. Thank you. As many already understand, COP stands for Conference of Parties and has been held every year by the United Nations as a formal meeting to implement international climate change policy and shape negotiation. COP has been held for nearly 3 decades now, bringing together world leaders and climate scientists to provide that global push to address climate change and its effects. So if we move to the next slide, thank you. So some key actions taken due to COP have been the following major international agreements. The Kyoto Protocol was the first major climate commitment in 2005, which aimed for industrialized countries to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Some countries positively led on this reduction, but at the time, some large nations did not sign up, highlighting how this was very much a work in progress. During the 2010 COP in Mexico, the Green Climate Fund was established, which aimed to help developing countries to transition to a more low emission and climate resilient environment. Currently, the Green Climate Fund holds around $9.8 billion pledged by countries and across public and private sectors. The fund is being used to finance around 100 projects internationally to increase climate resilience, overcome any challenges in the renewable energy market, and overall provide a more sustainable future. In 2013, the COP was held in Poland, and a pivotal moment was the introduction of nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, which allowed individual countries to take ownership of their climate commitments and actively progress them. And this links to the 2015 COP held in Paris, where the Paris Agreement formed a commitment to bring nations together to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Recently, and quite alarmingly, however, a report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, have found that under the current national commitments, it is likely that warming will exceed 1.5 degrees during our 21st century. So due to these international commitments set, COP has been key to transition to a more sustainable future. So if we move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So how do the developments from COP meetings impact the work of actuaries and other finance professionals? So professional actuarial judgment is needed when assessing physical climate risks, such as weather-related events like floods or storms, or temperature-related health issues linked to extreme weather. Transition risks needing actuarial judgment can include, for example, the financial risks of insurers and pension funds owning assets with dependencies on carbon consumption. And some liability risks which actuaries need to consider in their work could be risks to corporates or insurance firms from people who have suffered losses stemming from climate change. Sustainable financial services and products that support the transition to a lower carbon sustainable economy are needed. And professional risk management through holding funds and mechanisms like the Green Climate Fund are key for supporting climate action and actively assessing future risks. The regulatory landscape has shifted to increased environmental considerations, such as from the PRA's expectations of firms responding to climate risks to the current mandatory TCFD disclosures for large companies. The also climate change risk scenarios are being monitored by EIOPA from this March 2023, involving insurers to comply with assessing short and long-term climate change risk in the autumn. The IFOA Sustainability Board have produced a climate change reading list, which provides a detailed guide to improve an understanding of climate risks and opportunities. There will also be an SDG reading list produced soon, detailing how each sustainable development goal, what it is and how they are relevant to the work of actuaries. So if we move to the next slide, please. So some recent COP events have been instrumental in the development of policies which have shaped the current climate legislation. So COP26 was hosted by the UK and held in Glasgow in 2021, during which the UK announced to become the first net zero aligned financial centre. The Glasgow Climate Pact was formed to accelerate global climate action, and a new International Sustainability Standards Board was set up for consistency in sustainability disclosures. Following from COP26, some recent developments include the publishing of the government's 2023 Green Finance Strategy, which sets out how the UK is building on the legacy of COP26 by accelerating growth in green finance. COP27 was held in Egypt during November 2022 and introduced a youth-led climate forum, and concluded with establishing a loss and damage fund, which aims to support countries most impacted by the effects of climate change. COP28 will be held in Dubai, and this will mark the first global stocktake to assess the progress made in achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement and form further actions for the 1.5-degree goal. The plans will include cutting global emissions 43% by 2030. Ahead of COP28, the International Youth Climate Delegate Programme has been launched to ensure that young people from climate vulnerable countries and youth voices overall are at the centre of climate policy. Young people are the catalysts for positive change and can hope to enable the international community to act faster and with more ambitious climate goals looking forward. Thank you, and I'll kindly hand over for the next part of the presentation.
Thanks, Rinyani. So now we've had a summary of what COP is, let's think a little bit about what happened at the most recent COP. So we can just flick the next slide. So obviously COP is a big conference. There are lots of outcomes from the whole conference, which we can't cover today because we have limited time. So what we've done is we've set out 6 of what we think are the main outcomes from Egypt last year on the slide, which we'll talk through separately in a minute. But first of all, let's take a little bit of a step back and just think about what the aims of COP27 were before the conference. So COP in Egypt was centered around 4 key themes, which were mitigation, adaptation, finance, and collaboration. And one of the main goals of the conference was to follow on from COP26, which was largely about setting targets and to focus on how these targets can then be implemented. So if we start with the first row of the slide there, arguably one of the biggest things that happened at COP27, which Rinyani also just mentioned, was the agreement to create a loss and damage fund. So the idea of this fund is to help support developing countries who often are the worst hit by climate events, but have lower carbon footprints and have often contributed the least to the problem. So the idea is that this fund will provide financial compensation for losses and damages due to the climate crisis. Why was that such a big event? So this is a major milestone because developing countries have been asking for this fund for almost 3 decades now. So it was a really positive move to see this finally being agreed. However, not all outcomes from COP were as positive as that. So this brings us on to the next 2 points on the slide. So as Rinyani mentioned, in 2015, the Paris Agreement had 2 temperature goals. So the first was to keep the temperature rise well below 2 degrees C. And the second was to pursue efforts to limit the increase to 1.5 degrees C. So at COP26 in Glasgow, it was agreed that countries would focus on the 1.5 degrees C target because the science is clearly showing now that 2 degrees C of warming is not safe for the planet. However, in Egypt, in November, a number of countries tried to back out of this target. Ultimately, they failed and the 1.5 degree target stayed in there. Although one thing that was removed was the idea of the 2025 emissions peak. So this is the deadline that science says we need emissions to peak for 1.5 degrees C to be achievable. So 1.5 degrees C was kept alive at COP27, but barely, arguably. So moving on to the bottom row, some things that were kept in to the final decision text at COP27. So one thing that was included for the first time was the acknowledgement of the danger of something called climate tipping points. So a climate tipping point is a mass climate event that is irreversible and would cause widespread implications to the planet. So an example of that might be the melting and collapse of Greenland's ice cap, which could cause huge sea level rises and wouldn't be able to be reversed. So it was a positive move to see those being acknowledged for the first time. Another pledge that remained in the COP deal in Egypt, although after a much heated debate whether it should or not, was the agreement to double the amount of finance for developing countries by 2025 to help them adapt to climate impacts. So how this differs from the Loss and Damage Fund is that this money is pledged to help make adaptations such as building flood defences, restoring coral reefs to act as natural hurricane barriers, or building weather-resistant infrastructure to try and limit the damage that would happen in the future. And then the final point that we've highlighted here as one of the key outcomes is around oil and gas. So in Glasgow during COP26, there was a commitment made and an agreement to phase down the use of coal. So that was the first time a resolution on fossil fuels was included in the final COP text, which is probably quite surprising for a climate conference that has been as long running as this. And in Egypt, there was a call from some countries to extend this further, to commit to phase down all fossil fuels. But in the end, that failed, and the resolution wasn't extended to more fossil fuels, such as oil and gas. However, the final COP27 text did contain a provision to boost low emissions energy, which could be seen as a positive step, but it is open to some interpretation of what that actually means. So, for example, how you interpret the term low emissions energy can differ. You might take it to mean renewable energy sources like wind and solar, but it could equally be used for nuclear power or even gas, which is itself a fossil fuel, but is a lower emitting fossil fuel than coal. So if we move on to the next slide then, to think about what else happened at COP27 beyond typical climate change topics. So last year we saw the formal recognition of several new issues for the first time in the COP decision text. So it's the first time we've seen a link between climate change and water and food security. FAST initiative was created during COP27. So that is the Food and Agriculture for Sustainable Transition Initiative. That was created between the Egyptian presidency and the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. We also saw forests have their own section for the first time, and it emphasised the need that we should slow, halt and reverse the loss of forest cover and carbon loss due to deforestation. And then finally, another new entrant to the text was around nature-based solutions to tackle climate change, such as restoring ecosystems and limiting deforestation, even though an effort to more explicitly link nature and climate in the text ultimately failed. So that might be something where we see more progress in the future. And then the final slide that I want to cover just on COP27 that Trinyani alluded to, if we can just flick to the next slide, was around a topic that at the Early Careers Board we think is really important, and that is around intergenerational solidarity and cooperation when we're thinking about the climate crisis and possible solutions. So for the first time, as well as head of states, government ministers, academics, young people were also invited to participate in the global negotiations. And there are a number of other milestone events for young people at COP27, some of which you can see on the slide. So they became official stakeholders in climate policy under the Action for Climate Empowerment Plan. The Children and Youth Pavilion at COP27 was located within the blue zone of the conference for the first time. For those of you that aren't familiar with that, that is in a UN managed space which hosts and coordinates the global negotiations. So before this, at previous COPs, young people groups were visiting the green zone, which is outside of where the decision making happens. So that was a very positive step. COP27 also held a dedicated Youth and Future Generations Day on the 10th of November. This was covered by the Early Career Board's coverage on LinkedIn and in the blogs on their website. So if you're interested, I encourage you to look at those afterwards. And there was also the first ever youth-led climate forum at COP27. So the reason that we wanted to highlight these editions is because it demonstrates the role that young people and younger people have to play in finding solutions as well. And at the Early Careers Board, we believe that that's true within the actuarial profession as well, and that our junior members, junior actuaries, students, have a lot to bring to the table in terms of different perspectives, and these different perspectives can help us spark innovation when we're thinking about how we can use actuarial skills to look at climate risk. So I'll now hand over to Andrew, who's going to speak to you a little bit about what progress we've seen made since COP27.
Right, thank you very much, Elle. So, well, good afternoon or morning, everyone, wherever you are in the world. Before we get started, I hope you don't mind me saying that all views and opinions I express today are entirely my own and not those of my employer. But given that, I'll kick off the 2-week-long COP27 summit. Had a far-reaching agenda with a number of different themes being addressed, including finance, science, youth, gender, and so on. And since the event in November itself, it's been possible to track how a few of the various initiatives that are announced have been progressing, and to read about other significant developments in some of the other thematic areas. And all of those themes are important in their own way, but as I've got limited time, I'm only going to focus on a few of those specific areas, which are adaptation and agriculture, water, and biodiversity. And this is a quick overview, so I'm sure members of the audience will have other examples of important developments. So please do share these at the end, or pop a question in the chat if you feel like I've missed anything out. Okay, so to start with adaptation and agriculture. Well, agriculture is a fairly straightforward term, I'd feel. So we all need food, but climate change can affect a country's ability to grow crops. If you think floods, droughts, and unsuitable weather conditions and so on. But there's also a big impact going in the other direction as well. So since our food systems actually produce around 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions, there's quite a complex interaction between climate and agriculture. So we need to find an arrangement that works for both. Adaptation is more generally about making sure that communities are in a position that is resilient to the impacts of climate change. And a resilient community will definitely need stable and secure access to food and water, but a number of other things as well. So one initiative which relates to agriculture is Agriculture Innovation Mission for Climate. And this is an initiative which was launched at COP26 and is led by the US and the United Arab Emirates, with over 30 other supporting countries. And the aim of this is to increase global research and development in the agriculture domain. So the initiative's website has a number of examples of the different technologies that the initiative's partners are working on, including exciting things like vertical farming, genetic tools for selecting livestock which produce less emissions, and climate analytics for helping farmers to make data-driven decisions when weighing up like crop quality with efficiency and emissions impact on the environment. And at COP27, the group provided an update on the progress to date. And since then, India has actually already has also joined as a government partner to the initiative. So the project would appear to be building more and more momentum over time. So that's definitely one to keep an eye on going forward. The other initiative that I wanted to mention is Climate Responses for Sustaining Peace, or CRSP. And the purpose of this particular initiative is to use positive climate action as a way of actually promoting peace and stability in the communities which are suffering the negative impacts of climate change. And I suppose one example that I found documents how climate action in the form of new water pumps and improving a community's capacity to manage its water actually helped reduce conflict among a group of farmers in Nepal, where increasingly unpredictable rainfall is actually driving these farmers to start stealing water from each other in order to grow their own crops. So I was able to find a high-level update on this initiative, saying that the group has since come together to put together a roadmap for delivering on their objectives, but I still wanted to highlight that as I think we spend quite a lot of time in sustainability and climate change discussions thinking about the technological side of things, new inventions that are going to save the world. And maybe sometimes we take for granted that you actually need a stable social environment and peace in order to implement those things to have an impact. So there are some quite good examples online where a new technological solution was balanced with the need to take into account the existing social landscape. For example, you can read about a data analytics company which helped reduce conflict between different communities in a certain region of Chad in Africa by first producing a detailed satellite map of a territory and then working with different leaders from the local communities to essentially map out where the natural resources were and other important features. And then that map, which had been created by the collective group, was then used to support discussions and agreements over the use of those resources and how potential conflict could be resolved between the different stakeholders. So the solution was, yes, high tech, but it was also deeply rooted in what was actually important to those real people in those communities. Okay, so my next theme is water, and it almost goes without saying that this is fundamental to human life, but potentially another one of those things that we often take a bit for granted. But climate change threatens the stability of our water systems and the availability of the water that we use to drink, to stay clean and grow our food. But alongside that, it's also important not to forget that a significant proportion of the world population actually don't yet have access to safe drinking water or sanitation. So the challenge here is not only to ensure that our existing water systems are resilient to climate change, it's also to expand that access to clean water and sanitation for those underserved communities. Now, one of the biggest developments that happened in this space since COP27 was the UN 2023 Water Conference, which took place in New York last month. This was actually the first global UN water conference in 50 years and involved different representatives from UN countries coming together to raise awareness of these global water-related challenges. And in terms of the outcomes from that conference, there were 700 pledges of support over the course of the conference from various organisations. So whether those will be financial commitments or pledges to undertake specific projects. And the UN Secretary General actually announced that there would be a specific envoy for water appointed, which I guess represents that the organisation is taking water and the achievement of those water-related goals more seriously going forward. But I suppose the question you'd be asking is, is this enough? And well, I think it's fair to say that it's better than nothing, given that water hasn't been a topic that's traditionally been at the centre of the climate change and sustainability discussion, which is partially evidenced by the fact that it's taken 50 years to have another UN Global Water Conference. And the 700 pledges that I mentioned earlier are actually generally voluntary, so they're lacking formal binding commitments that could be used to hold the companies or the governments making them accountable. And in fact, after the conference ended, more than 100 experts signed a letter of concern to the UN Secretary General, speaking out about what they considered to be a lack of accountability, scientific rigour, and general ambition from the conference. So it appears that the response has been mixed, but time will tell very clearly whether we've collectively been moving fast enough on water-related issues to avoid more conflict. Okay, and finally, a quick note on biodiversity. Most of my research here focused on the Amazon rainforest, since it's one of the most biodiverse ecosystems in the world. And clearly one of the most important stakeholders in the discussion about the Amazon is Brazil, given that 60% of the Amazon basin is located within the borders of Brazil. And you may know that Brazil's current president was elected towards the end of October 2022 and has been promoting a narrative of reducing deforestation in the Amazon, among other things, which is significantly different to the attitude of the previous president. And you may also know that Brazil have already announced a desire to host COP30 in 2025. And this gesture was since formalized when they made an official bid for the COP presidency in January. You may have also heard of the Amazon Fund, which is essentially a pool of money started in 2009 to essentially financially support initiatives which promote the sustainable use of the Amazon's forest. The main donor of this fund is currently Norway, which has provided over 90% of the funding, with smaller contributions from Germany and a Brazilian state-owned oil and gas company. But since COP27, there's been information to suggest that other countries such as the US, France, Switzerland and the UK are all considering making donations. The US in particular has pledged support for the fund, although I'm not aware of any specific numbers or final commitments being made. So another one to just keep an eye on. And finally, a series of post-COP news articles, which you might find interesting from an actuarial point of view, where you can find articles that refer to the rate of deforestation in the Amazon in January 2023, being down by 60% compared to the previous January. So only 167 square kilometers of rainforest being destroyed in Jan 2023 compared to a higher figure in the prior January in 2022. And I found one news article with the following headline: Brazil's new president managed to slow Amazon deforestation by 60% in just 1 month. And well, if that headline makes you a bit suspicious, then I would say you're probably right to feel that way, because if you go looking deeper into that article, you can eventually find quotes from experts saying that, you know, while a drop is clearly a good thing, it's still too early to talk about a reversal in the trend, which you might infer from just reading the headline. And in fact, the measurements are based on satellite data, which is affected, or the accuracy of that is affected by essentially the amount of cloud cover in the region, which is particularly heavy early on in the year. So some nuances there, which you only really get if you read beyond the headline. Fast forward 1 month to the deforestation in February 2023. News articles reveal that February 2023 was actually the worst February on record for deforestation, which was 62% higher than in February 2022. So, you know, a seemingly contradictory message, which might leave you thinking, you know, what is actually going on? Well, if you trace back the satellite data to its source, which is, I believe, the National Space Agency of Brazil, then you'll find out that they actually have a web portal where you can access this data for free. So I downloaded the relevant data set and plotted out the monthly deforestation data to obtain a graph which looks like this. And as you can see, the data's got a pretty strong repeating periodic pattern and is generally quite volatile. Now, I'm sure you can crack out your CS2 time series skills and do some interesting analysis to work out what trends are actually present. But you know, I'd suspect that you need more than a handful of months worth of data to claim that deforestation is significantly decreased. But you know, please do challenge me on that if you think otherwise. The data is out there. But I think a good point to take away, and what I'll end on, is essentially that you know, as actuaries and actuarial students, we should be in a good position to test and challenge any like claims or statistics that are thrown around in the sustainability world. And to link it to the early career perspective, you really don't need to be a chief actuary with 30 years of experience to start asking some quite basic but important questions about how figures are being derived and whether we do have statistical, numerical, sufficient statistical or numerical information to make certain conclusions. Okay, I think I'm going to pass over to Sarah now.
Thanks very much, Andrew. So I'm just going to talk briefly and kind of build on what some of Thrulani covered in the introduction by looking at what's going to happen and what we hope will happen at COP28. So next slide, please. So as was mentioned at the start, COP28 is taking place later this year. So from the 30th of November to the 12th of December. And it's going to be held in the United Arab Emirates and specifically in Dubai. So from COP27, the focus was really on being an implementation COP, but there were concerns that not enough tangible progress was actually made to change the dial on the emissions the emissions that we're expecting, and therefore the temperature outcome that we're likely to achieve. And that was really brought home by the IPCC's report in March, which just kind of illustrated how far we are at the moment from where we need to be. So, as Twinoni mentioned at the start, one of the key things about COP28 is it's going to involve the conclusion of the first global stocktake of what was agreed as part of the Paris Agreement. So in Paris, countries agreed on nationally determined contributions. They said this is what each country was going to do, and then they went away and they have to report back on the progress against it. And also the intention is to revise ambition upwards as well. So countries are making more and more commitments over time. So the agreement was that every 5 years, there'd be a 2-year process to really assess in detail how countries and how us as a world are performing against the Paris Agreement, and this is when it's all going to come together in COP28. So it started in COP26, and there's been assessments of what's been done, and this will be presented at COP28. And the idea is it will help align efforts on climate action and allow delegates to put measures in place to bridge the gaps in progress. In practice, it's likely to be quite a somber wake-up call, because it will really force people to acknowledge and to show in the assessment that we are not where we need to be. And there's a huge amount that needs to be done. So that is the hope for COP28, that as part of this process, it will bring home to everybody just how much more there is to do. And then clearly the second step of that is to agree revised action and agree new activities which get us back on track. And perhaps the first one we can be more confident about, and the second one, time will tell how it actually comes to pass. Just picking up on a few things in relation to COP28 itself and the hosts, UAE. So they've said in announcements that they've made that the conference we focused on the economic case for inclusive climate action. So they're adopting very much a kind of business-focused approach. And there are some parallels there with a lot of the finance work that went into COP26. And again, this is potentially an area that actuaries can get involved, because we are very good at understanding financial situations, understanding financial risk, and being able to help share with people the value of different courses of action, and help create that kind of business case. So overall, UAE has promised to seek bold, practical, and ambitious solutions to the most pressing global challenge of our time. So there's a really strong commitment from them that they know this is really important, and this is a really key time for our society, and we really know that time is running out. Next slide, please. And if you can just click as well, so the text comes up. Okay. So just talking about some of the challenges associated with COP28, it's quite a complex backdrop. So UAE are a very significant exporter of fossil fuels, and there has been quite a lot of press, and some quite negative press, in relation to Sultan Al Jaber, who has been appointed the COP president. So he's also the head of state oil giant ADNOC in UAE. And ADNOC has actually pledged around 150 billion in the next 5 years, which will include increases in oil and gas production capacity. So in the face of it, this is quite a challenging situation to be in. And there are some concerns around perhaps conflict of interest, and the fact that the International Energy Agency, as part of their scenario saying how we're going to get to net zero, they've been quite clear that in order to achieve that, we shouldn't have any new oil and gas investment. So there are differing views here, and it has the potential to be a bit of a sticking point. So again, time will tell whether these negative perceptions are played out or whether or not it actually provides a forum for everyone to come together, which is what the UAE have said is what they want. So inclusive and practical agreements that are actually feasible. And I also kind of mentioned on the previous slide that there really is the acknowledgement, including the IPCC report, that we don't have much time left. We're nowhere near where we need to be at the moment. If you could just bring up the next text, Andrew. So in terms of what we're hoping will be achieved at COP28, it's going to be really important to secure global support for action. And I've got on this slide, hopefully it's big enough that you can see it, kind of a temperature graphic from the carbon action tracker. And this was showing that around the time of COP27, we're on track for, I think it's around a 2.7 degree temperature outcome by 2100. And there actually wasn't much change to this thermometer and to this expected outcome as a result of the agreements that were made in COP27. So there was progress and there were new things that were set up. But in terms of actually getting us down towards the 1.5, that is something that we still very much need to do. So that will need to be a focus at COP28. There will also be a lot of building on what's already been done at COP27 and indeed at previous COPs. So agreement on the role of fossil fuels, that was a bit of a sticking point in COP27. And as I've just kind of touched on, it will potentially be another area of challenge at COP28, but it's one where we really do need progress. And loss and damage, which was a key outcome from COP27, there's been a lot of work going on since in terms of pulling together actual proposals for how that will work in practice. So COP28 will be the opportunity to really review those and hopefully we'll launch the fund. Finally, in terms of finance, I mentioned that UAE are very much focused on adopting a business approach in terms of the way they think through things and in terms of thinking about financial implications. And finance is obviously really, really important too. So hopefully one of the things that will achieve is helping to scale up finance in a way that appeals to investors and to different organisations. And one of the key things which is talked about, though not yet confirmed, is that there may be some reforms to financial institutions who provide a lot of finance, particularly to developing countries. So these are institutions like the World Bank. And that's also something that we may well see agreed as part of COP28. So overall, there's an awful lot to do. And quite a lot of it, as Andrew mentioned, does touch on things which we are interested in as actuaries. So we may well see opportunities to get involved in some things coming through. That was all that I wanted to cover. So if anyone does have any questions for any of the panelists, please let me know. I can see there is one question in the chat from Mohammed. Yeah, and absolutely take your point on the geographical locations. Did that to tie in with the kind of the IFOA's theme around Egypt.
Yeah, I think hopefully the rest of the people in the call can see that I typed out a response to that earlier.
Sorry. Yeah.
I think it's fair to point out the inconsistency. So I hope it's not distracted from the content or the discussion that we're trying to have. But yes, that's a good observation.
And I think we'd be really keen if anyone does have any of your own either reflections on COP27 or experiences from how this is affecting your day-to-day work, or what you're hoping for from COP28. that would also be really, really good to hear. I guess maybe whilst we're waiting for people to think of any questions, Andrew, you're currently on my screen, but if we just go around everybody, and in terms of the work that you do, do you feel that, you gave that one example of how actuaries can provide a critical eye and help to sense check and make sure that what's being reported is working well. So are there any other roles that you kind of see actuaries as getting involved in?
I mean, it's a very interesting question, and I don't think I'm in a position to sort of comment on it in too much detail. But yeah, I suppose just by being an actuary, you have access to volunteering opportunities on things like the Sustainability Early Careers Board, which I think has been really educational for me. And I guess if I had to point out one thing in particular that I've learned, it'll be when I was researching and looking over the content of COP27, it struck me that, one of the thematic days of gender was actually very significant. So pointing out the fact that in reality, women are often experience, I guess, negative climate impacts to a harsher extent than men, which was a perspective that I hadn't really sort of come across before. But when you sort of read through the arguments, it makes a lot of sense. But yeah, I'll pass on to the rest of the panel if they wanted to comment on the actual question that was being asked.
Thank you, Andrew. I believe as actuaries, we really are at the core risk managers. So I would probably say that potentially keeping ahead of climate legislation and keeping on top of any policies or amendments is really the key to our work. I also think from an insurance perspective, it is quite reassuring and quite positive to see how the insurance industry is actively taking steps to transition towards a net zero global future. So for example, quite recently, actually back in 2021, the first UN convened net zero insurance alliance was launched at the G20 climate summit. And since then, it's actually grown to about 29 insurers and reinsurers, representing around 15% of the world premium globally. So I found that quite interesting and actually quite a positive way that the insurance industry is heading towards. So as actuaries, risk managers within the industry, I think putting more of an encouragement on these steps and really growing this pool to make sure that more insurers join and actually actively set targets for their respective insurance and reinsurance sort of underwriting teams to actually set these independent science-based targets to aim for that net zero transition is really key.
Yeah, just to add to that as well. So one thing that for me, it came out of a discussion with Patrick from the Sustainability Board that we had a few weeks ago, was the idea that as actuaries, we often look at long-term projections and bring things back to today. And when we're talking about climate, we're often talking about sort of 2050, 2100. And as actuaries, we're used to projecting things back from the future to what that means now and what actions we can take now to influence those outcomes. So I think that's something that we fit really naturally with. And then I think in terms of how you can get involved and how it impacts your work, it will obviously vary depending on what practice you're in. But there are some obvious examples for people that work in general insurance, physical risk to insured properties and things like that will need to be considered when you're setting your assumptions. Same if you work in life insurance, this will have impacts on health and mortality, depending on what we do or don't do to tackle the climate crisis. And pensions, investments, how people are providing capital to enable things to actually change and happen is all work that falls under the institutions and areas that actuaries working. So I think everybody can find something that brings us back into their work.
Yeah, thanks very much, everyone. There's some really interesting answers there. And I see that there is a question from Suki, but it may effectively have been answered by 390 as part of your kind of general answer. So the question was, really helpful update. What are the actions that each of us as actuaries in the insurance industry can influence directionally? So I don't know if anyone wants to add anything more on that.
I think, sorry, I was just going to say, I think in terms of insurance industry as well, just if you think about wider ESG rather than just necessarily climate as well, then there's also a social role that insurers can play in terms of providing protection for people through the transition, for example. That's another area that I think that actuaries can focus on in insurance.
And that's a really interesting point as well, kind of coming back to COP28 and the very business kind of mindset that it looks like UAE are going to be adopting as the COP president. So, making sure that within that social aspect doesn't get lost. Andrew.
I was just going to mention that it's an ongoing area of debate, isn't it, in terms of specific actions, and I think, yeah, we've considered using the IFOA's new online digital communities platform to start discussions on that sort of thing. So if anyone does want to, I guess, have a follow-up discussion in that forum, then I think we'd be more than happy to sort of express our views.
Yeah, that sounds good. I don't know if it's possible to put any kind of link to it as part of the email that goes around after this, but if it is, we can potentially do that. And in terms of the comment that someone made around just sharing knowledge, I can't remember if it was Thrunani or El. So that's, as was mentioned at the beginning, something that the Early Careers Board was doing during COP27, and may well be something which is done either via the digital communities platform or LinkedIn, or indeed all of those kind of sources going forward as well. So do keep an eye out for those kind of updates, these kind of events, and also if you're interested, sign up to the sustainability newsletter, which is a really valuable source of information as well. And there's a lot of work within volunteers in the IFOA that goes into that. So I'm not sure if there are any other questions. If anyone does have a question, if you just want to kind of put up your hand. But if not, maybe we'll just spend kind of 1 minute getting any final thoughts and reflections from each of our speakers today. So Thrunani, I don't know if you want to go first.
Yes, I thought it was a really helpful sort of talk and discussion, focusing on how as actuaries we can really impact all these types of different areas, and also how COP really can help us to essentially keep us updated on climate legislation, and also different areas that really impacts our work. So I think it's been a really helpful discussion to help us to keep updated on these areas.
I can go next. I suppose my sort of takeaway would be, well, I guess by involving myself in the Early Career Sustainability Board and in this event, it has been sort of working outside of my comfort zone, as it's not something that we spend hours and hours learning about as part of the exam process or anything like that, but just that it's been very rewarding, and I feel like I've come away with a much better understanding of the materiality of these various issues. So I definitely encourage anyone else to get involved, even if it feels like, oh, I can't see myself exactly relating, or I don't have a great understanding of the issues in sustainability yet. I think there's definitely a lot of knowledge to be gained there, and you'll probably thank yourself later from putting in the effort up front.
Yeah, I just add to that, I guess, from my takeaways is that there is still quite a bit to be optimistic about. good things are happening, not happening fast enough at the moment, and we do need a bit of pessimism, I think, to keep the urgency on and see things actually happen. But hopefully, we all walk away with a feeling that there is stuff that we can do. And one thing I would say, especially to early career people, is that a thing that I found quite refreshing about when you talk about sustainability and climate topics is, it's still relatively new for a lot of people. Nobody has all of the answers to these things, so it's quite a safe space, and everyone's learning about this stuff at the same time. So definitely don't feel that you need to be an expert to get involved. That everyone starts somewhere and everyone's figuring it out together. So I'd really encourage you to go away and even do you know what your firm you work for is doing? Have you read their reports? Who was involved in creating those reports? Speak to those people, and obviously feel free to reach out to any of us on the Early Careers Board. More than happy to give you advice on how to get involved or where you can go for information.
Yeah, thanks very much, everyone. That's been really, really useful and interesting, and hopefully valuable for attendees as well. So just as we're coming to the end, I think that Nikki's going to share a couple more slides, including information about giving feedback on the session. Yeah, so if you are able to give feedback, please do scan this code. It will be great to hear what you thought of the session and what you'd be interested in for other sessions, and specifically from an early careers perspective, is if there's anything more that the Early Careers Board can be doing in order to kind of engage you in this topic, or anything that you'd like to be getting involved with. So that would be really, really helpful if you could do that. So now we're just going to draw this event to a close, and thank you to everyone for attending. I'd especially like to thank Elle, Andrew and Twinini for their excellent contributions and a fascinating discussion. And hopefully it won't be the last of these kinds of discussions either. So that concludes today's event. Thank you everyone for joining us, and goodbye.